Welcome, advocates, to another episode of the Leading Equity Podcast, a podcast that focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their schools. Today's special guest is Kerry McDonald. So without further ado, Kerry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, Sheldon. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Oh, pleasure is mine. I'm excited because you're going to be talking all about some alternative learning models. But before we get into that, I'd love for you to start off with telling us a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
So I am a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, where I lead the Education Entrepreneurship Lab and host the twice weekly Liberated podcast, where I interview entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are launching new schools and emerging learning models all across the U.S. I started the podcast back in early 2022 and now have over 300 episodes with these sort of everyday entrepreneurs who grow fed up or with kind of the standardized one-size-fits-all test-driven schooling model and decided to go off and create something new and different. And so my new book, Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling, comes out tomorrow and really showcases the stories of these entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are building these innovative education models and really creating a much more sort of decentralized bottom-up approach to U.S. education.
All right. Well, congrats on the new book. Folks, links in the show notes. Grab yourself a copy. It's out tomorrow. I'm excited for it myself. And let's get into it because I want to talk about, and I'm assuming it's in the book, but a topic that I think is really what's going to resonate with our audience here in regards to equity in education are some alternative learning models that you wanted to share with us today. So I want to start there. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I've been involved in education and education policy for over 20 years. I sort of became interested in alternative education and learner-centered educational models back in the early 2000s when I was in graduate school at Harvard University and thinking about not only alternative schools, but alternatives to school. How could we look at education beyond schooling? And so for the sort of the subsequent 2 decades, I spent a lot of time looking at alternatives to school. These would be things like the emerging microschool movement of intentionally small, highly individualized, mixed age learning models that were starting to sprout in the 2000s and 2010s, as well as the growth and diversification of the modern homeschooling movement, which was becoming much more reflective of the US population as a whole, demographically, geographically, and ideologically. So I was fascinated by this movement around, again, alternatives to school, which I cataloged in my 2019 book called Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. And that book came out in May of 2019. And of course, fast forward a year later in the spring of 2020, when everyone was all of a sudden at home learning and living alongside their children, and schools were closed and remote learning was just starting to ramp up. And sure enough, more and more families became interested not only in my Unschooled book, but this idea of what else is available when our local public school isn't available. What else is possible? And so you saw, for example, in that summer of 2020, the spontaneous rise of what were known as pandemic pods, which were sort of these parent-driven learning communities and families figuring out ways of getting together safely to provide opportunities for their children to learn together, often connected to their local public school online learning experience, but doing so in, again, these kind of small social environments. And many of those pandemic pods evolved into sort of full-fledged microschools, and more families kind of looking at alternative education models. So that's what I really wanted to describe in Joyful Learning, is sort of what has taken place over the past 5 years. Because again, this growth in microschooling, alternative education, learner-centered schooling models, that was gaining traction in the first couple of decades of the new millennium, but really skyrocketed in terms of interest, popularity, and abundance beginning in 2020, as more and more families began to seek out innovative innovative learning models, and more entrepreneurial parents and teachers began to create these new learning models. And so that's, again, what the book really focuses on, and what the focus of my work overall emphasizes, because the vast majority of the founders who are building these microschools, learning pods, various types of homeschooling collaboratives, other low-cost private schooling options, the vast majority of them are former public school teachers. This was true, again, in my Unschooled book in 2019. These are teachers who felt like their own creativity was being stifled within the sort of standardized test-driven model and decided to go off and do something better. And now more and more families are realizing that this is a possibility for their children and are seeking these spaces out.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. And I can appreciate that there's all these different models out there. And I kind of want to touch on, just so I'm clear, and maybe some of the audience is there clear as well, as far as what a micro school is. So could you take us through, what is a micro school? What does that mean?
Yeah, so a microschool is a sort of a catch-all term for a variety of innovative education options. And I describe some of this in more detail in Joyful Learning, but they're typically low-cost, highly individualized, multi-age, learner-centered educational environments. They could be private schools recognized by the state as a private school. They could be various types of homeschooling collaboratives, often that meet 5 days a week as a full-time schooling alternative at a fraction of the cost of a traditional private school. But sort of their commonalities, again, independent of structure, is that they really challenge sort of the standardized schooling status quo. So they really are focused on meeting each child where he or she is at, not relying on, okay, you're in the 4th grade, so this is sort of the one size fits all curriculum for you, but where are you in terms of math and in terms of literacy? And let's target our curriculum and our educational approach toward your specific needs and interests. So in that way, microschools, I think, are really sort of reflective of the personalization that we enjoy in other parts of our lives. We have so much personalization and individualization in other areas of our lives, and microschools are now sort of bringing that personalization to families, again, in very low cost ways. And we can talk a little bit about the expansion of school choice policies, if you'd like, across the US, that are making a lot of these models even more financially accessible to families. But there's also public schools, public school districts that are now catching on. They realize that this microschooling model is successful, is sought after. And I'm increasingly hearing from school superintendents and administrators in traditional school systems that want to kind of bring the microschooling model into their communities.
So are they looking to bring it into their school districts, like as part of a school, like a school within the district? Or I guess I'm trying to be understanding, because a lot of school districts, at least I live in Phoenix, and so a lot of, and I would imagine a lot of across the United States, funding comes from enrollment, seat time, and those kind of things. And so I'm just, so I'm clear, it sounded like you said that a lot of schools or districts are looking to add micro schools. I'm just trying to see what's the benefit on their end when it comes to funding. So maybe I missed it.
Yeah, I would love to talk more in depth specifically about Phoenix, because I think it's a sort of hub of education, entrepreneurship, and innovation in all kinds of ways, and a hub of sort of this idea of equity in education and accessibility for families. Specifically, I can think of the Prenda Microschool model in Mesa, Arizona, just outside of Phoenix, that I write about in Joyful Learning, that is embedded within a district elementary school, the Eisenhower Elementary School in Mesa. And I talk at length about that particular model. But I will say, even beyond that, I recently interviewed the superintendent of schools in Indiana, who is working on building a microschooling model within the not only his district, but also throughout the state of Indiana, which, like Arizona, has a lot of these sort of school choice options. Those are expanding, lots of different microschools arising, lots of low-cost private schools. And now he's really excited about seeing the ways in which public schools, traditional public schools, can integrate this microschooling model within their schools. And I think we're just at the very beginning of seeing that, because so many more families want that that personalization, that learner-centered experience that's really tailored to their individual child's needs. But I'd love to focus a little bit more on Phoenix, if you don't mind, because it's
Yeah, yeah.
a
I know where
key.
Mesa is. It's right here. Yeah. I
But
live on that side.
even in Phoenix proper, it's actually a focal point in my book, not only just for two reasons. First is, again, a lot of education, entrepreneurship, and innovation happening there. And then I would say, not coincidentally, because of universal school choice policies in Arizona, Arizona being the first state to launch universal school choice, applying to all K-12 students across the state back in 2021. Now there are 16 states that have universal school choice, enabling education, a portion of education funding to follow students to their preferred learning environments. And just in Phoenix proper, there I talk in Joyful Learning about a microschool for middle school and high schoolers that's focused specifically on LGBTQ plus youth, who most of whom were in conventional public schools, and was not a good experience for them. They were bullied. They didn't feel like their individuality was respected. They felt like they were not thriving. And so thankfully, these entrepreneurs created this LGBTQ plus focused microschool that's flourishing now, and that the students are able to attend tuition free, thanks to the Education Savings Account, the Universal ESA in Arizona. So that's just one example. There are so many other schools and spaces, microschools, low-cost private schools, learning collaboratives around the Phoenix area that I talk about in the book that meet sort of every individual preference and need, and more emerging every day.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that there's a school that's specific to LGBTQ plus community. You got a lot of students that are experiencing all types of mistreatment from peers, from staff, and everything. Just simple things as just pronouncing correct pronouns can sometimes be an
Exactly.
issue. And so I'm glad or bathrooms, right? And so those are some things that we're seeing that are happening in some of our traditional schools. So I'm glad to hear that. My next question was going to be, is this something that is free to students? But you answered that question when you said that it is available for the students there as
In
well.
in states like Arizona that
Mhm.
have universal choice, that have robust school choice policies, a key factor, key characteristic of many of the microschools that I talk about in my work and in Joyful Learning specifically is they're affordable, they're low cost, they tend to be less than $10,000 per year. In fact, the National Microschooling Center did a sector analysis in 2024, and they found that 3/4 of the microschools that they surveyed cost under $10,000. Only 3% cost over $20,000. So they're right in that price point for a lot of these school choice policies in Arizona. The ESA is somewhere between $7,000 and $8,000 per student per year, higher for students with special needs. And many of the microschools are sort of pricing themselves right in that space so that they're able to make sure that these programs are fully affordable for any family that wants them. So again, 16 states with universal school choice policies, 35 states plus DC and Puerto Rico that have some version of private school choice, in many cases that apply to these innovative programs like microschools.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Mesa. Like I was just in Mesa yesterday to take my son roller skating to a birthday party. So I'm in Mesa a lot. And so yeah, it's right. I'm on the east side of Phoenix and Mesa's right there. So I'm glad to hear that. Here's a question that I have because I'm wondering about, again, I'm learning a lot as you're talking about the micro school. So I have so many questions, but the
Yeah,
next one
yeah,
I have is accreditation. So I'm assuming there's state sanctioned accreditation. I'm getting my high school diploma once I'm done. Talk to us about what are some of the, I guess, key differences maybe in micro schools versus a traditional school, and maybe are these schools accredited, and can I take whatever I earned on to college and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the programs decide to become accredited private schools, some don't. I mean, I think it's interesting to note that only 20 states require public schools to be accredited. So accreditation can be something that some families and founders are looking for in an innovative learning model or a school specifically. Accreditation is required in some states as a part of participation in a school choice program like we were just talking about. That's not required as of now in Arizona. So Arizona has all kinds of different learning models, including learning pods or homeschool collaboratives that may not want to be accredited, or there may be sort of barriers for them to becoming accredited because they are much more organic, often much more sort of responsive to the real-time needs of an individual child, as opposed to having a kind of a set curriculum or specific standards. So, but I also think that accreditation is changing as well, and accrediting agencies are looking at, again, this momentum, this demand for these innovative learning models, and they're responding by trying to figure out ways that they could provide an accreditation pathway to some of these emerging schools and spaces that want it.
Okay. Yeah. I know that might be a concern for some parents as far as like, is the school accredited? I could just hear all my school counselor friends like saying whatever they're saying, like, wait, how's this? So I could see like there's obviously some pros and cons, if you will, or some things to consider if you're a parent that's looking into transitioning your child out of what we would call a traditional campus into a micro school setting. And I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
and if I could just say, Sheldon, too, I actually talk a bit about this in Joyful Learning, too, is it targets both families kind of looking for these innovative learning models, as well as founders and future founders wanting to create them. And I make it clear to families, here are some things to look for as you're assessing the quality of this emerging ecosystem of schools and learning models, and a little bit of sort of buyer beware. How do you make decisions that feel right to you, that are aligned with your values and viewpoints, but that also have sort of quality indicators that are meaningful?
Can we talk about that? Like, what are some things?
Yeah.
Let's say I am a parent
Yeah.
that's looking at, let's say I have a parent that has something that they're, for whatever reason, traditional campus, even charter schools or private school, whatever it is, whatever school they're being educated at, is not meeting the needs that they need. Do you suggest jump on Google and say, type in Microschool for X, or like, what are some things that they need to look for? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of different resources. I have a whole appendix of resources for families. Some are more national, where you, again, you sort of could Google Microschools. You could look, again, I mentioned the National Microschooling Center, a wonderful resource for families and founders looking for these programs. But often it's hyper local resources that are particularly valuable. In Arizona, in particular, there's some great kind of parent driven organizations that try to connect families to various education options. Facebook groups, I think, are some of the best resources because this world is really dynamic. There's often new programs emerging and others that might be evolving in different ways. And it's often these sort of parents in these Facebook groups that have their finger on the pulse of what's actually happening, what is good quality, what are some programs to really look into, what are some that you haven't been satisfied with. And so we're seeing that again, that emerging ecosystem evolve of kind of recognizing quality. But in terms of some of the quality indicators, and some of the founders that I spotlight around the Phoenix area would fall into this, are families returning the next year? What does a retention rate look like? And often you'll see 100% retention rate in some of these programs because families are just so thrilled that these places exist. One of the reasons I called the book Joyful Learning was because these are spaces that kids really want to be at. And so there's numerous stories of kids who might have previously had kind of Sunday night stomach aches, dreading Monday morning in a traditional school, again, traditional school, public or private. And now when they're in an environment where they are seen, where they're respected, where they have that personalized, intentionally small learning environment, they're thrilled to be at school. I have stories around, here I am in Cambridge, Massachusetts, stories around kids who, when there's a snow day, are upset that they can't go to school because they just absolutely love being in these spaces. It's just such a wonderful experience for them. And I just think that that's important for both teachers and parents to realize that this is possible in education, and it's happening certainly in the private sector, facilitated in large part due to school choice policies, but not exclusively. It's occurring in states without school choice policies too. And it's increasingly happening in traditional public schools as well.
Do a lot of these schools have services such as special education maybe ability challenges that might be out there? Or should a parent look for a school that's specific to those needs?
That's a really great question. And what I hear so often from founders is, again, many of whom are former public school teachers, is that they are creating these spaces often because children with special needs, especially children who are who might be on the autism spectrum, who have ADHD, who have dyslexia, all kinds of special needs, that their needs are not being met adequately in the traditional school system. Many of these founders are former special education public school teachers who kind of saw the ways in which even a child with an individualized education plan within a traditional system were not having their needs fully met on an individualized basis. And so they go off and create these new models. I think about, for example, one of these sort of rock star education entrepreneurs, Dominique Burgess, who runs Learning Academy in North Carolina, a former public school teacher and administrator who was working with special needs students in the traditional system and grew frustrated that she wasn't able to serve her neurodiverse students as adequately as she felt they should be served. And so Berbrella specifically focuses on the needs of neurodiverse students as well as neurotypical students. But I hear that over and over again, that these, again, intentionally small, highly personalized learning environments can be especially valuable for students with special learning needs.
Thank you. Now, we have a lot of educators that are out there, and I don't know if you keep up with the burnout and folks that are leaving education, leaving school for whatever reason, and they may be considering starting their own school. I'm tired of these canned lesson plans. I'm tired of these guidelines or whatever, and I just don't have the autonomy to be able to teach the way I want to be able to teach and student centered. And this is just where I'm at. Do you have any tips or information or strategies of how, if I want to pursue starting my own school, maybe some steps that I would need to take in order to do so?
Yeah, so that's really why I wrote Joyful Learning. It's for people who are looking to build or find a microschool or some kind of innovative education model. So there's all kinds of tips and strategies for families and founders, especially those teachers, as you mentioned, who are burnt out within the traditional system and want to create something new. But some of the great, I would say, microschool accelerator programs or organizations that can help prospective founders go from idea to launch in a successful and sustainable way. So sort of running these sustainable schools and spaces. A couple of them, one would be Launch Your Kind, that was founded by Iman Aline in South Florida. She's, again, a former public school teacher who launched her own Microschool Kind Academy and then wanted to help other founders to create their own. So she runs Launch Your Kind, which is, a great microschool accelerator program, as well as KaiPod Catalyst, which is another program. Lots of founders in the greater Phoenix area that are part of that free microschool accelerator program. Aman's is free as well, that enables you to, again, start your program and figure out what it takes to run a successful, sustainable school.
Okay. All right. So, of course, the tips are there. Would you suggest trying to do this by yourself or maybe collaborating with multiple educators? Like, let's say a group of you, we're all done with school this year. We're gonna move on. Like, what do you think are some suggestions in that area?
I've seen it work well both ways, with an individual founder and an idea and a vision who goes off and finds interest in his or her community and realizes I'm onto something here. This is something that families really want. But I've also seen it work really well in teams or small groups of educators who kind of come together, leveraging their own strengths. So I think it can happen in a variety of ways. I think one of the great things that I'm seeing now, and why I think we're just at the beginning of this sort of movement towards more of these low-cost learner-centered spaces, are sort of the network effects that are emerging. So you have lots of founders now who have created these new schools and spaces. And so then other prospective founders hear their stories, read about them, hear on Facebook groups about them, and they say, oh, that person is just like me. They were a public school teacher and now they're running this school and are finding great fulfillment in that. So if they can do it, I can do it too. And oh, by the way, now there are these accelerator programs that can help me. So there's network effects from the founder side as well as in the family side. So again, those parenting Facebook groups, education Facebook groups, where parents are now aware that there are a whole assortment of education options, creative schooling options for them to explore that are more financially accessible than ever.
Okay. And I hear you say financially accessible and low cost. I'm an
Yeah.
educator that wants to start my own school, and I say I don't have the money to start my own school. Is there funding available in order to do so?
So there's a variety of ways to approach this. Again, I'm seeing more and more gravitate to states that have universal school choice programs, places like Arizona that have for a long time had school choice programs and have sort of a culture built up around parental choice in education. In the book, I talk about a founder who was a charter school founder in Baltimore years ago, kind of entered the charter school sector because he felt that that was a place of experimentation and innovation in education, and then grew frustrated that over time the charter school sector began to kind of have those same standardization and test driven pressures that traditional public schools had. So he ended up leaving and moving to Arizona to start Trinity Arch Preparatory Academy for Boys in Phoenix, and says that it's the kind of school he's always wanted to create, and of course financially accessible due to these school choice programs in Arizona. So I think that to the extent that founders are able to kind of operate within these states that has the option for families to sort of move their education funding to their desired learning environment, I think that's great. There are philanthropic organizations that are helping founders get started. I think about, for example, the Vela Education Fund that provides micro grants to these entrepreneurial parents and teachers creating microschools and similar models. They have over 4,000, or they've provided grants to over 4,000 of these entrepreneurs over the past 5 years, and they continue to grow and be successful. But a lot of this is thinking about you're starting a small business, whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit. And again, that will depend on various state and local regulations and preferences. But some of it is, it takes a little bit of a risk to go out there and open a new school and hope people like what you're providing and then are willing to pay for that.
Bottom line, it's going to take some risk. And I think that's a primary message there. And then I would say you also got to move to Phoenix. Is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. You're in a great spot for this movement. It's really neat.
You got me thinking. Maybe one day I'll do
There you
something.
go.
So listen, I'll say this, Carrie. I have thoroughly enjoyed learning about Microschools and the work that you're doing and your book that's coming out, Joy, that's out tomorrow. And I would love for you to take us home with any final words of advice that you want to provide to our listeners.
Yeah, thanks. I would just say that, again, I've been involved in education for a long time, and I've never been more energized than I am right now because there is such a proliferation of creative schooling options for families and lots of opportunities for families, for learners, and for teachers to be creating and working in the kinds of learning environments that matter most to them. So I guess for parting advice, I would say that if you can't find your ideal learning environment, it's never been a better time than now to build it, and that more and more families will find what you're doing attractive and compelling and come to you. And then I would just end by saying, welcome folks to visit my website at edentrepreneur.org for more resources and a whole list of ideas and tools to kind of get started, whether you're a parent looking for an option for your children or a founder who is eager to build one.
Perfect. Once again, I'm speaking with Kerry McDonald, author of Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. And that will be out tomorrow. So again, links in the show notes. Folks, grab yourself a copy. Kerry, it has truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been great. Thanks so much for having me.